Welcome to Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name is Susan Havlin, Managing Consultant for our geology team. Today I'm joined by Tarrant Elkington, who is the General Manager with us at Snowden Optiro. Tarrant leads our global business and has almost 20 years of experience of consulting in the mining industry across a range of commodities and geographies. Welcome.
Thanks, Susan. Good to be here.
The topic of this podcast relates to the crossover between the resource geologist, the mine planning engineer. We're going to do a couple of podcasts in this area. This one focuses on the things that resource geologists should consider in providing their models to mine planners. So, Tarrant, could you start by telling us what motivated you to talk about this topic?
I guess for me, the big thing is that you're only really as good as the world that you understand. So if you're a geologist and you only just focus on your area, or a mining engineer and only just focus on your area and don't understand the other parts of how the whole mining business works, then you can only be so good. So for a resource geologist who produces trying to estimate what's in the ground, just estimating that is not enough. You ultimately need to think about how that model is going to be used downstream of producing that resource estimate. So I think that may be a little bit controversial, but it's not just about estimating the ore; it's about making it useful downstream processes.
So, what are some of the issues you've encountered in your experience?
So a few things, but I'll just mention a couple. So one is that often a resource model can be passed on without any discussion with a mining engineer or any documentation that allows them to understand what it is that they're receiving to do the work. Sometimes a resource model just doesn't consider the needs of what a mining engineer does. It's just estimating what's in the ground, and going back and fixing that after the fact can lead to rework or loss in time, and sometimes that's important when you're doing a study. And sometimes you get these really big models, because computers can produce things of scale, and that can really increase the time it takes a mining engineer to do work without really any benefit to the overall project itself. So during the podcast, I'll talk about a few things or ideas, that I've come across in my experience. I mean, generally, resource geologists do a great job, but I see, in doing mine planning work, a range of different models come from a range of different consultants and companies that produce them. So this is just a share of my experience on what I think best practice is, and something that we try to adopt here at Snowden Optiro.
When you say that a resource model sometimes doesn't consider the needs of the mining engineer, what do you mean?
I think sometimes when we've received models from resource geologists, often we only get a model of the ore, and it might be just contains the main element that you're trying to estimate for revenue. But to me, a resource model needs to be more than that. It needs to provide the basis for being able to optimize the mine plan and complete the financial evaluation of a project.
What are some examples of what a resource model should contain?
Well, I think if I come back to the previous point, it shouldn't just consider the main revenue-bearing element. So often when you talk to a metallurgist, and if you do that up front, they're going to ask for a whole bunch of other elements, things that are important drivers of value in the project. It might be deleterious elements. So usually just estimating the one main element is just not enough. You've got to put more things in. Secondly, while there's called it a resource model, the resource model needs to consider more than ore. It needs to consider waste and the surrounding ore body. I mean, we need to be able to model dilution. We need to understand what the density is in the waste, so we can get tonnages correct and things like that. And thirdly, I need to make sure it's got all the various categorical fields that we might need for mine planning and other things. So for example, some models don't contain weathering because the resource geologists didn't think it was important But for a mine planner, that's really important. Or sometimes lithology, metallurgical domains, potentially geotechnical domains is something, potentially acid forming or not acid forming. Those are all important bits of information that should be contained in this thing that's a resource model that forms the basis for mine planning.
You talked about model size before, and by adding extra fields, this is obviously going to make models bigger. So how do you think they should be reduced?
Yeah, look, I think some of the stuff that I talked about above does make models bigger. It adds more fields and whatever, but obviously that information is important and important enough to make the model bigger. When a model is bigger, it takes longer to churn through various optimization, scheduling processes. So I think it's all in balance. But there's some things potentially that get added into resource models that maybe just aren't necessary. So one thing that I would suggest is try to avoid infinite subcelling of block models. We don't need 1 centimeter blocks. It's beyond the precision that we can either estimate or be able to mine selectively. The second one is to think about where you're adding in, making blocks smaller to add definition. And so within the ore, fine, you're trying to reflect these maybe thin loads or whatever. But in the waste, we don't care to be so precise. And so you can possibly have bigger blocks in waste. Quite often people try to replicate the size of the blocks in the ore as in the waste, and it's not really necessary for us in mine planning. And often, because the majority of these models expand in waste, that could be a big driver of model size, and also potentially stripping out some of the resource estimation fields when you provide a model to an engineer versus when you hand it on to another resource geologist to review it. So things like kriging efficiency, search paths, and those sorts of things that I, as a humble mining engineer, don't understand, but they're not needed for the mine planning work.
So one of the questions I really always struggle with is how much waste do you need to include for, say, a open pit around the ore body? Is there a rule of thumb?
Yeah, if you think about it, we just need to have enough waste to be able to take material that's at the bottom of the resource all the way to the top with a wall, right? So often your wall angles might be 45 degrees as a random number, so I want to have something a bit shallower. So you want to project up, but 45 is a convenient number, right? Because as far down as you go, you've got to go out on either side. So at the bare minimum, I would go for whatever the depth of the ore body is, from the edges of wherever the ore body is in plan, go out that same distance. And then add, a little bit on, 20% maybe on, just for good measure. If you want to do a further cleanup of that, you could actually project up from the bottom at an angle of say 30 degrees to be conservative. And what that allowed you to do is to trim out all the waste that's at depth that's not filling that rectangle or that you're trying to fill with blocks, and that can cut down on your number of blocks by half or a third or something like that. And they're really blocks that are never going to need.
Okay. What are your thoughts on rotated models? Because resource geologists don't overly like them, but obviously some deposits need it.
Yeah, I think, I can't talk to necessarily from the geologist's perspective. From a mining engineer's perspective, and using software, it's annoying, right? So it's always better for us to work on a mine grid that's orientated to the ore body. Right, and so mine planning on that is so much easier. Things don't need to get moved around. Obviously, I understand that if you want to keep a grid, and your ore body doesn't run parallel to it, or you've got multiple ore bodies that run in different directions, that you need that might be necessary, and it's necessary because it helps minimize the number of blocks that you have in the model. So I think it's just a trade-off. I think if you could get away without it, then that's great. But if you have to do it, I think the software is progressing and things like that people can, we'll make do with it.
Cool. Any other bugbears you want to erase?
So I guess mainly just around the tidiness of a model. So when you have a final model, ideally for mine planners, it wouldn't have negative grades or absent values, because sometimes they can cause issues when you've got downstream processes that you're applying, or in pit optimization, there's some, it can sometimes try to ignore some of those blocks without telling the user. So, for me, it'd be better to control that through confidence in your classification and things like that, so that we can filter the blocks out that way. And really, the most important thing to me is to along with the model, provide a good handover, with documentation and things like that, so that the mining engineer can understand exactly what they're getting, and there's no misunderstanding at that exchange point between the resource geologist and mining engineer. Things that haven't been, that have been mined, but shouldn't be mined, or or fields that should be considered when reporting the model.
So what sort of handover should be completed?
So ideally that takes the form of a note. And I know you've produced a really good one here at Snowden Optiro, which is particularly useful and helps put our standards in place. But just needs to explain what fields there are in the model, what the values are for each of those fields, so that because everybody does things differently. Some people might put classification in, 1 is measured, and some people might say 3 is measured. We use numerical codes to reflect, text, right? So just to be absolutely clear about that, to understand the extents of the model, to understand which grades should be used in the model and which ones might have been, might be ancillary to the mine planning process. Things like that are particularly useful. And really, it's really good if the geologist and the mining engineer have talked before the model has been really created or finalised, because I think if people can look at the drilling together, if they can look to understand what bench heights are appropriate, because if the model comes at a certain block height, then that might make it difficult to model certain bench heights. Consider what are the right block sizes, which is maybe a compromise between mining selectivity and the spacing of the data that's available. The extents of the model to consider, as you said, on the pit optimization, or maybe a dilution halo around an potential underground mine, because for an underground mine, you probably don't need to add all that waste that sits around it, just a dilution around the ore body, and then any fields that are needed for the mine planner, a metallurgist, environmental, etc. Those conversations are the important ones to have, to make sure that model has the rich, data in it needed to go forward.
That draws this podcast to a close. Tarrant, thank you for joining us on Fresh Thinking and for participating in this discussion.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. If you'd like to listen to more of our Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro podcasts, you will find them free on the website, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms.